Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting a basket of strawberries. I've never painted a woven basket before, so I thought that it would be fun to try to break down the pattern. This is the reference picture that I used for this particular painting. I ended up changing the shape of the basket a bit so it fits the dimension of my sketchbook. This is a picture that I found on Pinterest and I will link the original image in my description box in case any of you are interested. When I was painting the basket, I wasn't actually looking at the reference photo. I just wanted to make sure that it fits well in my sketchbook. So I made the handle a bit longer and the basket itself a bit longer. And for the sketch, I also drew out the main ribs so I know where to place all the little details of the weave. For the strawberries, because the basket is a little bit different to the original image, I did try to follow the reference, but if there are any spacing that is a little bit odd, I'll try to just fill it in so there are no awkward spaces. And by the way, if any of you are interested in the outline, I will also have it available in my coffee shop. You can just find the link in my description box so you can have the option of tracing and painting straight away without sketching your own. Okay, so that's the sketch done. I will go over the colors before we start painting. This is Lamp Black, Carmine, Buff Titanium, Permanent Yellow Deep, Ultramarine Deep, and Sap Green. I will also be using Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. So let's begin to paint. I'm going to mix my own brown by first creating an orange from Permanent Yellow Deep and Carmine, and then I use Buff Titanium to lighten the brown, and whenever I want it to be a bit darker and muted, I add Lamp Black. So this is the brown that I've come up with. I'm just looking for a light to medium tone of brown, and I'm just going to paint short lines going over the first rib on the left across to the next line. Once the paint settled and it's mostly dry, I'm going to take a lighter brown with a bit more Buff Titanium and I'm going to paint small vertical lines in between the small lines that I've painted earlier. I added more Buff Titanium and Permanent Yellow Deep here to refill my palette and to also create a slightly different tone of brown, and I'm just going to use this to paint across in between the lines that I've painted horizontally, and I'm going to paint going across the second rib towards the third rib. Then I use a slightly thicker consistency of a darker brown and just line underneath all the horizontal lines, and then I'm going to follow this up by painting the vertical lines in between, just like what we did with the first rib. I'm also going to do the same going back to the first lines, and you can always do this whenever you feel like the color is fading a bit too much. I'm also going to fill in a darker brown in between the lines that I've already painted so it doesn't look white and empty. Originally, I didn't feel like it was important to paint double lines for all the ribs, but it turned out to be much easier because I get a better visualization of it, so I'm just going to double up the lines for all the ribs and then continue on painting. I was trying something new here and I wanted to make the illusion that the lines going across the ribs are protruding outward, so I want this area to be a bit lighter, but I found this a bit too redundant after I've painted on the darker color and as I've smoothed out the lines. So you don't have to do this and just create the lines as with the previous lines that I've done so far. The colors are not so different here, so I wanted to separate those two woven lines, and I just used a darker brown for this. I'm painting the line with this dark brown diagonally. It's not overly angled, but it's just very slight to give some form to the weave. For the second half of the lines, I'm going to turn the angle upwards, and I'm using a thinner stroke. Then I'm going to fill in the darker brown color in between the ribs again, just to separate those lines. Once I'm done, I'm going to paint the long vertical lines in between the horizontal lines that I've just painted, and whenever you feel like you need to separate those lines, you can go back in with a thick consistency dark brown. I'm going to repeat the steps again. For the top portion, I made the horizontal lines more straight, but as I get towards the bottom, I'm going to tilt it downwards a bit more. Same goes for the right hand side. It's a bit more straight at the top, and as I get towards the bottom, I'm going to tilt the lines upwards. So those are basically the steps that I took to paint the whole woven basket, at least for this portion anyway, and I'm just going to keep on repeating this. You don't have to follow the exact method. If you find it easier, you can also do the zigzag pattern of those horizontal lines before painting on the vertical lines. I'm actually going to do this towards the end just to see which one was more comfortable for me, but I actually find that painting it this way is much easier because you get to see each part of the weave more clearly, whereas if you do a bunch at a time, it can get a little bit muddled up together and it's not easy to define those lines anymore. So I'm just going to keep on repeating this, but what I want to mention here is that those lines are a bit longer in the middle compared to the ones that I paint on the side. So hopefully you can see that the lines are a little bit shorter on the left side, whereas the part that I'm painting right now are a bit wider. So this is what I'm going to do as I get to the right hand side as well. I'm also going to darken the color slowly, but if that's too difficult to do, we're also going to glaze it over with a darker brown. When I was painting this, I really tried to focus a lot on the reference photo just to help me visualize the pattern itself. So you might want to do that if you decide to attempt this painting. Before I finish painting the basket, I realized that the strawberry is in the way and it'll be much easier for me to paint the strawberry first, so the lines that I paint for the basket will be easier to paint on because the areas that I'm going to avoid is much clearer. So that's what I'm just going to do now. I'm not going to go in too much depth with painting the strawberries. In fact, when I was painting this, I forgot my own method, and after a while I picked it up again. But There is actually a better tutorial on how I paint strawberries. If you guys haven't seen it, it is quite an old tutorial, but it's one of my favorites. So I'll just link the tutorial in my description box if you guys are interested and haven't seen it yet. The colors that I use here is quite different, but it doesn't really matter to use which specific color. It's just anything that looks like it. You can also mix your own colors if you don't have specific ones. So as an example here, instead of the naphtha red that I use as the base strawberry from my tutorial, here I use Carmine mixed with a little bit of permanent yellow deep and also lamp black. So this is something that you can alter, and even though I show you guys the exact colors or the color mixtures that I'm using, it's not necessary, and you can always mix your own with whatever is available to you to create something similar. Here, as you can see, I'm back to painting the woven pattern again, and this time I decided to paint the alternating horizontal lines without painting the ribs, or I just realized that it's probably better to call it spines since they're vertical lines. But when I was doing this, I realized that it was quite difficult to see which line is on top of another line, and at one point it felt more muddled up compared to the method that I used for the left side. You can also try these two methods and see which one is easier for you guys, but I found that painting one section at a time like I did for the left side is much easier for me. Moving along to the top part of the basket, I'm going to follow the reference and do a braid pattern like a hair braid, but with edges to show that the material is flexible and yet stiff at the same time. So whenever there's a curve in the line, I paint them in angles instead. When I was painting this part of the basket, I couldn't really figure out the placement of the line, which ones are placed on top of another. So I tried to make do by just following the direction of the lines facing inwards towards the middle and the outer braid to slightly curve towards the braid on the inside. For this part, I used a medium tone of brown in a light to medium consistency, but I will paint the lines in between where the negative areas are using a darker brown with more lamp black in the mix. I tried to create really fine lines with the darker brown, and I tried to just mostly outline it and make a clearer definition for the braid. Since the tone of brown is quite similar for the body of the basket as well as the rim, I decided to just line the bottom of the rim with a medium consistency dark brown to separate those two areas. Before I paint on the basket handle, I'm going to paint on the strawberries first because they're placed in front. So I started by painting the base color of the strawberry leaves using a mix of sap green and permanent yellow deep. I'm going to wait for the leaves to dry now and paint the strawberries. For the base of the strawberry, I use a mix of carmine with permanent yellow deep for a more orangey tone of red, and for a slightly deeper red you can use a little bit of lamp black in the same mix and it will just make the red look richer. With whichever tone of red that you're going for, you can also use the colors from my previous strawberry tutorial, but what I'm going to do here is to isolate the brightest part of the strawberry, then I paint the surrounding area with the same color while leaving a little bit of negative space here and there to suggest the strawberry seeds, and then I paint ovals alternating in height and following the curvature of the cross contour lines of the strawberry on the area that I've left blank for the highlight of each strawberry. While doing this, please be mindful of how your strawberries are positioned because the curve and the placement of the highlights will greatly depend on this in order to give a three-dimensional form to your strawberries and also make it look more plump. I'm going to follow this up by creating a dark red mix. For this, I use Carmine and Lamp Black as my main color. Then I add a tiny addition of Permanent Yellow Deep just to warm up the red. With this color, I'm going to paint in between the strawberries while painting ovals again, following the curvature of the strawberries on the base red area that I've painted earlier. Here, I decided to add Lamp Black to the previous mix in order to make an even darker red, and I'm just placing them in deeper spaces to define the strawberries further. I think I've painted enough of the strawberries for now, so I'm just going to let the paint settle. And I'm going to move on to paint the leaves. I use Sap Green with a little bit of Lamp Black to darken it slightly, and I use this color to paint one side of the thin strawberry stem and also the shadows and folds of the leaves. After the colors have settled, I can see now that the red of the strawberries faded a little bit, so I decided to use the same base color red, and I just glazed part of the strawberries, which might look kind of pale. Moving on to the handle of the basket, I used the same mix of Carmine Permanent Yellow Deep with Buff Titanium and a touch of Lamp Black, and I just paint curved lines around the handle. Personally, I like using limited color palette, but if mixing is a bother for you guys, you can also use browns like Yellow Ochre, Burnt Sienna, and Burnt Umber if you'd like for the basket. After I finished painting the light brown, I added more Lamp Black Carmine with a touch of Permanent Yellow Deep to darken it. Then I used it to add lines in between the curved lines. I like to also layer on an even darker brown for the inner part of the handle, and then I glaze the inner part of the light brown handle with a medium tone brown to give more volume. Here, I also decided to outline and separate each strand of material of the basket, and I'm just going to keep layering and glazing to slowly build the form by playing with the values. To finish the painting off, I want to add a loose cast shadow underneath. For that, I used a mix of Carmine, Lamp Black, and Ultramarine Deep to make a dark purple. Then I used water to dampen my paper first, and my brush was a bit dirty here, but it's okay. Then I used a thick consistency of this color to paint underneath the basket, and I just let the paint bloom outwards on the damp surface. After the paint travels and lighten in color, I like to add more pigment to increase the depth and vibrancy directly underneath the basket. Then to bring everything together, I'm going to use the same color to glaze over darker parts of the shadows, like the bottom and right hand side, along with some of the weave, which might be facing in the opposite direction to the light on the left. I actually forgot one more feature, which is to add some strawberry seeds. I used bleed proof white mixed with Permanent Yellow Deep in a medium consistency to try to make the color less opaque, or you can also use zinc white gouache for a transparent white. Then I'm going to add the final adjustments, like adding the vibrancy of color, or here I'm readjusting the position of the highlights and pulling some of the red towards the white to make the highlight less glaring. And here's the finished painting. I think I still need some work to paint the basket, but I think it was pretty good for my first try. Hopefully it makes sense for you guys as well. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links and outline will be in my description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!